In this video, we introduced the imperfect middle and the imperfect passive indicative in Koine Greek, and those two are going to have the same forms. We also introduced the aorist middle indicative and the pluperfect middle and the pluperfect passive indicative, which also have identical forms to one another. So yet again, you're going to see this slide and you're coming to some of the last times you're actually going to see it before we move on to mood, that is. So as a reminder, Greek, highly inflected language, changes its forms to for different grammatical purposes. And we've seen this in the last few weeks with respect to the middle voice and the passive voice in these different tenses. And this week we're going to get it with the imperfect and the aorist tenses. Or in this video, we're going to be addressing the imperfect and the aorist tenses in the middle and the passive. We'll also come back in the next video to the aorist tense in the passive voice. With respect to the imperfect, we're dealing with both the middle and the passive in this video. But with respect to the aorist, we are only dealing with the middle because the aorist passive is going to have a different form from the aorist middle, whereas the imperfect uses the same forms for both the middle and the passive voice. And so if you remember back to our previous week, we learned the primary middle and passive suffixes, the mai, sai, tai, mtha, ste, ntai, and we saw these on the present, middle, and passive indicative. So these are our present middle forms and our present passive forms. And this week we get a new suffix or new endings. And these are the secondary middle and passive suffixes, and this is going to be sort of your main point of memorization for this week. Main, sa, ta, mtha, ste, nta. And what we're going to see is that the secondary middle and passive suffixes are used for the imperfect middle and passive indicative, which are going to be identical to one another. That is, the imperfect middle is going to look exactly like the imperfect passive, just like the present middle and the present passive looked identical to one another. And the way that you identify whether it's a middle voice verb or a passive voice verb is based on the context of the sentence itself. These suffixes are also going to be used for the aorist middle indicative in both the first aorist and the second aorist. And as I noted earlier, that there are going to be separate forms for the aorist passive indicative, and we'll look at those in the next video. Quick pause here and remind me what is the difference between the first aorist and the second aorist? Absolutely right. The first aorist uses sa. The second aorist is going to change its tense form, or it's going to change its stem to form the aorist. It is what's called a strong verb. We have these in English. The English present tense go changes its form to went in the past tense. That is similar to what the second aorist does. It changes its stem to form the past tense. And so what we're going to do here is, because this is going to be your primary area of memorization for this week, we're going to first practice speaking it, and then second, we're going to practice writing it. So together we will 3 times go through these endings, saying them aloud. So let's go ahead and do this now. Main, sa, ta, mtha, ste, nta. And again, main, sa, ta, mtha, ste, nta. And one more time, a little bit faster here. Main, sa, ta, mtha, ste, nta. All right, and so now what we're going to do is, I've put these up here. Take one more look at them before you attempt to write them from memory on your whiteboard here. So take one more look, and now they're going away. Go ahead and pause the lecture and try and write down these endings. If it looks like this, go ahead and give me the high five here. Boom. And if not, we're going to have one more chance. So here it is, endings up there, and I'm going to take them away in just 1 second here. So take another look and go ahead and pause and fill in on your whiteboard one more time. And do they look like this? If so, give me a high five, or even if they don't, you can give me a high five too. Boom. And let's move on. So these are the different forms that we are looking at in this video. The imperfect, middle, passive, indicative. Remember, they're going to be the exact same. They're going to look exactly the same. The first aorist middle, the second aorist middle, and then we're going to close out with the pluperfect, active, indicative. And I give you these here to show you sort of where we've come with respect to indicative verbs so far. You'll notice that there's not a whole lot of space left here for us to fill in more indicative forms. And that's because you're almost done with indicative verb forms. You've almost learned all of the indicative verb forms that there are in Koine Greek. Once we finish the next video, we'll have this whole thing filled out, and we'll be able to move on to bigger and better things. And so I give us here the way that these verbs are formed. So the imperfect, middle, and passive, they're going to use the secondary middle passive suffixes that you're memorizing for this week. And then they stick them on to the ending, but some other changes happen as well. So as always in the past tense, we get the augment with the epsilon, or there are, remember, other forms of the augment. A verb that begins with a vowel is going to lengthen its vowel to form its augment, and the same is true for diphthong. So you're going to have an augment, then you're going to have that stem, lu in our case for luo, then a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, and then these secondary middle passive suffixes stuck on. So men, we're going to skip this one for a second. Ta, matha, stay, nta. And notice down here, I give you the change that's happening in the second person singular, that when the connecting vowel, omicron, is added to the end of the lu, so we have lu plus omicron plus saw, this combination here, the omicron plus the saw, the sigma drops out. A sigma doesn't really like to be between two different vowels, and these two omicrons contract with one another and they form oo. And so that's how we end up with oo as our ending rather than saw over here. And so here is how the the first aorist middle indicative forms. Once again, it's going to take an augment because it's a past tense verb. The augment is our clue to the past tense. We then have the stem, and then in the first aorist, we have the saw. We're not going to have that saw in the second aorist, and then those secondary middle passive suffixes stuck right onto the saw. So you can see over here we have the augment, we have the verb stem, we have the saw, and then we have our ending. And that's the case with men. We're going to skip this one for a second. Ta, metha, stay, nta. And with the saw added to it, samen, sata, samatha, saste, and santo. And over here, we once again have contraction occurring. So with the saw plus the saw, pronounced the same way, though spelled differently, this sigma in the middle right here drops out because it does not like to be in between two vowels. And then the contraction of an alpha plus an omicron, when those two come into contact with one another, they're going to make an omega. And that's how we get the so over here from the saw. And then our formation of the second aorist middle indicative. So first aorist and second aorist are going to look different from one another. Again, tell me what the difference between the first aorist and the second aorist is, or how does the second aorist form? That's right, the second aorist forms by changing its stem. It's what's called a strong verb. So what we get is we get our augment, we get the modified stem of the second aorist, we get a connecting vowel, and then we get those secondary middle passive suffixes. And so you can see that over here with A is our augment, lip is our augmented form of lape. Remember, the present active indicative form is lapo. Then we get the connecting vowel omicron here, or down here it's going to be epsilon, and then those secondary middle passive suffixes added right on here. And then once again, we have changes between that are going on in the second person singular. So, and it's the exact same change that we saw with the imperfect middle and passive indicative, where this sigma drops out, the two omicrons contract with one another to form oo here. And so if we put all of our paradigms that we just learned or were just introduced to on one page, they look like this. And you'll notice that they look really similar to one another. So they look similar to one another, not only, of course, in the endings that they use, because they're all using these secondary middle passive endings. But if you look at, for example, the imperfect middle passive indicative and the second aorist middle passive indicative, they're going to actually look exactly the same to one another, except for what's going on in their with their stem. So that we have the exact same endings here, and we also have the augment at the beginning on both of them, but the stem looks different. So if we look at then the imperfect middle passive indicative and the second aorist middle indicative of the same verb. So this is both of these are from the present active indicative verb lepo. The imperfect middle passive indicative is going to look exactly the same as the second aorist middle indicative, except for that one vowel. This epsilon has been lost, and that is the change of the stem that's happened in the second aorist to form the second aorist here. But otherwise, everything else is going to look the same with respect to the endings here. The most noticeable one, in my opinion, or the one that's most easy to recognize, is the first aorist, because it has that saw in there. So the saw is going to appear everywhere except for in the second person singular. So all of this to note that we have a number of similarities here, but we are going to have a difference in translation. So though they look similar in form, there's a difference in translation. Remember, or why don't you remind me, what's the difference between the translation of the imperfect and the aorist? Nailed it. The imperfect is ongoing action. I depict it like this. Whereas the aorist is simple, undefined action. In the aorist, the action is viewed as a whole, as a point, whereas in the imperfect, the action is ongoing in past time. So the imperfect is going to be I was loosing, or in the past, the passive, I was being loosed, and then the passive, I was loosed. That there's the action isn't ongoing in past time. The action is sort of completed and looked at as a whole. And so to sort of summarize the similarities and differences that we're going to see between the imperfect and the aorist in the middle and the passive indicative, the imperfect is going to be built on the present tense stem, so it's not going to change its stem form at all. It's that stem is gonna look like the stem in the present tense verb, the verb that you would find in the dictionary. And you're not going to have a tense formative. There's not going to be any saw in the imperfect. Whereas the aorist is going to be built on the aorist tense stem, whether that's with the saw tense formative added to the stem to make it the aorist tense stem, or the stem changing as in the second aorist. And then the similarities we're going to see is both are going to be using the augment, that epsilon at the beginning, or a lengthened connecting vowel if the verb begins with a vowel or a diphthong, and both are going to use those secondary endings that we are learning for this week. And so what I want to do is sort of put some of this, the things I've just told you, into practice here and see what you can recognize with respect to the aorist and the imperfect. So go ahead and take your whiteboard and just number 1 through 8. And what I want you to do is write aorist or imperfect based on what you see on the slide here. Identify whether we have an aorist middle or an imperfect middle or passive in each case. All right, and your results may look something like this, or these are the proper results. The right answer is here. Eluata is going to be an imperfect middle or passive indicative from luo. Notice that this lu has not changed at all. We don't have a saw on there. We don't have a changed form, so we have an imperfect built on the present tense stem. A lobometha is going to be aorist from lombano. This is a second aorist. The lomb has been changed to a lob. We've lost that mu in there. And this is going to be first person plural. A legamen is imperfect from lego. Notice this leg is still there, built on the present tense stem. A pimpsata. We don't see the sigma alpha explicitly, but the sigma is hiding there in the psi. Remember, via amalgamation, that a p plus a sigma equals psi. And so that's where we get this psi and then the alpha following it. So the saw is sort of hiding in there. So it's an aorist from pimpo, this one third person singular. A lipometha. Make a line over here because I was running out of space. An aorist from lepo. We've lost the epsilon in lip. And then just under it, a very similar form, but this one imperfect, built on the present stem lape. So we do have the epsilon there in that case. And then a didaskanta. It's going to be imperfect, built on didasko. So the whole didask is there. And then when it's in the aorist, the first aorist, we have a xa right here. So the kappa, when it's combined with the sigma alpha, has gone to this via amalgamation. So there are the answers. If you got them all right, go ahead and high five. 1, 2, 3, high five. If not, we're going to have another opportunity. And even if you got them all right, I encourage you to do it again. From memory, it should go a little bit quicker. Just having mixed up the order of the words. So go ahead, number 1 through 8, and once again, pause the lecture and identify whether we have an imperfect middle or passive or an aorist middle. All right, so here are the answers. This time I did not include the present tense verb form, but rather just gave you the whether it's imperfect or aorist because we did the present tense forms in the last slide. So we have imperfect of a lepometha, so the stem of lepo hasn't changed. Aorist for a lobometha, lombano has gone to lob. Here we have an aorist from didaxo. Remember we have amalgamation there hiding in that xi. A logamen is imperfect. The lego hasn't changed. The stem of lego hasn't changed. A pimpsata is aorist. We once again have the sigma alpha hiding via amalgamation right in there with the psi. A luata, an imperfect. The luo is the present form that hasn't changed. A lipometha, aorist. Lepo has lost its epsilon, which so it's changed its stem. A second aorist in this case, and then an imperfect here with a didaskanta, didasko being the present tense stem of the verb there. So once again, let's go ahead and high five for your correct answer. 1, 2, 3, boom. And move on to the very last thing we're going to introduce here. And we're going to do this one really quickly because it is a very, very rare form in Koine Greek, but I want to make sure that we put it up here because it's introduced in Black's grammar for this week. So the pluperfect middle passive indicative is going to use the secondary middle passive suffixes. You can see them over here, and there's no changes in this case in the second person singular because you'll notice no connecting vowel is used. These endings are added straight on to the stem. So we have main, sa, ta, matha, stay, nta, and it's going to get the augment and reduplication. So the augment, because the pluperfect is basically the perfect tense put into past time. So it's action that was completed, had ongoing results, but those ongoing results stopped by the time the word was written or spoken. So it's past action with past results that stopped by the time of the writing. So it sort of throws the perfect back one step further. So in a way, the pluperfect is a past time verb which is why it gets the augment, but it's also a perfect insofar as it indicates that the action that had continuous results. So it's going to get the reduplication. So we see here the epsilon is our augment, the lay is our reduplication, and then the stem here. And remember that reduplication can happen in different forms depending on what the verb begins with, what letter the verb begins with. All right, so now that we've introduced all these forms, what we're going to do is work with some of them in real live practice scenarios. So I'm going to read here, and I want you to be on the lookout for the verb in this sentence. We have hoi gar logoi tu prophetu agraphonta in to biblio. So you can go ahead and pause here and figure out what it is that's the verb in the sentence. And it's going to be agraphonta. This is our verb. And I want you to identify for me whether agraphonta is an aorist tense verb or an imperfect tense verb. So you can go ahead and pause the lecture here and identify this. I'm going to give you a little bit of help if you have a hard time figuring this out in just a second here. Once you unpause, you'll have some help. So here is your help for agraphonta, for figuring out whether it's aorist or imperfect, and for parsing it. So go ahead and pause the lecture, look over to the paradigms that we have for this video, that we introduced in this video, and go ahead and parse for us agraphonta. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'll write it out for us while you pause the lecture. So here's what we have. We have an imperfect passive indicative third person plural from grapho. So if we look over here, it's going to be right here on our paradigm. So grapho has not changed its form at all in this form. So that tells us we have imperfect, and we have imperfect middle or passive. And so we're going to have to determine from the sentence itself whether it's middle or passive. So I've made it the determination that it's passive because of the context of the sentence. So what's going on in this sentence is hoi gar logoi for, this is a conjunction, for the words of the prophet, so tu prophetu in the genitive here, showing possession. The words of the prophet, this is the subject of our verb, were written. It doesn't make sense for the words to write themselves in the book, but the words of the prophet were written in the book. So the action happens to the words, making it passive. So the context of what's going on here tells us that we have passive. So our translation, the words of the prophet were being written. Excuse me, I said were written earlier. Were being written. We want to get that ongoing action in there of the imperfect. The action was happening for an ongoing period of time. Were being written in the book. Here a prepositional phrase. The preposition in takes the dative after it, which is why we have to biblio, the book, in the dative case. Let's go ahead and do one more practice here. So I'll read, and as I'm reading, I want you to be on the lookout for the verbs in the sentence. E por you ata he saphe ace tain synagogain ton hypocriton hati epsiusata peri tu namu tois anthropois. So go ahead, and if you couldn't find them as I was reading, go ahead and pause and see if you can identify the verbs in the sentence here. And our verbs are going to be e por you ata, the very first word in the sentence, and then epsiusata. And the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is, given the paradigms that we've introduced in this video, to go ahead and parse e por you ata and epsiusata. And I will go ahead and do the same thing as you pause the lecture. All right, this is what we have for parsing information. Sorry, this is a little bit unclear. Let me draw a line here. This one is going to be for our first verb, e por you ata. We have an imperfect middle indicative, third person singular, from por you o my, which means I go or depart. So the epsilon here as the augment is going to tell us we have past tense, either imperfect, aorist, or perhaps pluperfect. And in this case, we're going to have an imperfect because of the form or the stem that it's built on. Poor you, notice, has not changed. There is no sigma alpha added for the first aorist, and there's no change of the stem altogether for the second aorist. So we have an imperfect, and the ata ending here is going to tell us it is third person singular, and it's by its form or what it looks like, it is either middle or passive, but in this case, on the context of the sentence, we know it is middle. And in this case, it's actually I'm not going to tell you this. We're going to come to it in just a second here. So based on the context of the sentence, we know it's middle. Let's move on to our next verb here. Once again, we have a past tense as indicated by the augment at the beginning, the epsilon here. In this case, an aorist. And we know this is a first aorist because of this saw in here. So it's going to be an aorist middle. It's not middle or passive. It can only be middle because the aorist passives are going to have a different form that we learn in the next video. Indicative, third person singular. Again, this ta ending is going to tell us third person singular. And the verb it comes from is pseudomai, I lie. And notice that in both cases, we have the omai ending being given to us in the dictionary form, which is going to be a clue to the next question here. And this is reaching back to previous material, nothing we've talked about in this video. Which uses of the middle verb do we have represented by aporuatai and epsusatai? So I want you to go ahead and pause and think about this question. I don't necessarily want you to go back and look up the different uses of the middle, but see if you can recall on your own what different uses of the middle we have here. So in both cases, we're going to have these being deponent middles. Remember, deponent is when a word is middle in form but active in meaning. So in both these cases, we're going to translate the words actively. And I told you that the lexical form, the form we find in the dictionary, ends with omai in both of these. Por you omai and pseud omai. And remember, if you find the entry in the dictionary or in Black's vocabulary lists with omai rather than o, so for example, luo is not a deponent verb because it's listed as luo. It has an active form. Poruomai and pseudomai don't have active forms, which is why they're not listed as poruo or pseudo. They're listed as poruomai or pseudomai because they because they are deponent. They don't have an active form. They've set aside their active forms, which is what deponent means, and use the middle to indicate the active. So if we're going to translate them up here, the subject of aporuatai is going to be he saphe, the wise one. So this is sort of a substantival adjective. The wise woman in this case, because it's a feminine noun. The wise woman went into the synagogue. So we have a prepositional phrase, into the synagogue of the hypocrites. So this is in the genitive case here because it's possessing the synagogue, into the synagogue of the hypocrites, because she had lied. Notice we want to do the whole action, or just she lied, I guess. She lied, so the aorist sense, not was lying, that would be the imperfect. She lied, looking at the action as a whole, as a point, as we often call it. She lied about to namu, about the law. So here we have another prepositional phrase, peri to namu. Peri taking the genitive case after it, as it does. Tois anthropos, to the people. And here we have this in the dative case because they are the indirect object. The lie was told to the people.